Hello everybody, I'm John from Craft Music, and I'm here today with the Moog Minimoog Model D, arguably the most iconic synthesizer of all time and back in production for the first time since 1981. For a great deal on the Model D, please contact your Craft Music sales advisor today or visit us online at craftmusic.com. Throughout the course of this video, you'll be hearing various playing examples from my coworker Adam. To hear more of the sound of the Model D, be sure to check out our separate performance video. Before RA Moog Incorporated introduced the original Model D in 1970, synthesizers tended to be large and modular, such as the Moog Legacy modular systems 15, 35, and 55 that re-entered limited production in 2015. And the Minimoog was developed specifically to address the impracticality of performing or touring with those large modular systems, and included what were deemed the most important or most popular modules, some of which were created entirely new for the Minimoog, and some of which were specifically adapted from their modular progenitors, such as the all-important Moog 24 dB transistor ladder filter. After developing models A, B, and C as prototypes, it was Model D that was deemed ready for release as a packaged commercial product. It was produced through 1981, shipping over 10,000 units, and far from being thought of as inferior or compromised compared to the large modular systems that it originally sought to mimic, really came into its own as a powerful instrument with a distinctive sound, and its design served as a model for arguably every self-contained keyboard synthesizer that followed it. Perhaps by virtue of being adapted from modular systems, the front panel of the Minimoog is divided into these sections that you can see here, including controllers, oscillators, mixers, modifier, and output. And this logical flowchart-like layout has made the Model D and its derivatives a great way to learn and understand subtractive synthesis. The controllers section includes the keyboard, first and foremost, which on the newly produced units has been upgraded to a premium Fatar TP9 keybed with velocity and afterpressure. And to go with these new keyboard parameters, there are new CV outputs here on the patch panel to connect those parameters to the destination of your choice, or even to share them with another CV-capable synth or module. Here we've routed the velocity sensitivity CV output to the loudness or amp envelope input. And an obvious place to route afterpressure would be to the filter cutoff. Note also that each of these CV outputs for the keyboard velocity and afterpressure have a little dedicated attenuator pot here on the back so that you can adjust the intensity or level of that parameter that's being sent out over CV. Left of the keyboard, and also included among the various controllers, are the thermoset gnarled pitch and mod wheels. Interestingly, the pitch bend wheel on the Model D isn't spring-loaded, but it is center detented so that you can get it back to 0 position easily. The mod wheel will dial in the intensity of whatever combination of modulation sources you select here using the other switches and knobs in the controller section, including the new dedicated LFO. On vintage Model Ds, there wasn't a dedicated LFO, but you could still get LFO effects by decoupling oscillator 3 from keyboard control and letting it run free as a mod source. On these newer units, you can still run all 3 oscillators and still have a dedicated LFO whose rate is controlled by this new knob here. Also, pulling up on the knob will switch it from being a triangle wave to a square wave. As I mentioned, the mod wheel will control the intensity of not just the new dedicated LFO, but whatever combination of mod sources you choose here in the controller section. There are 2 switches to choose different mod sources, and then a modulation mix knob to dial in the balance between the sources you select. On the left, you can choose between the filter envelope generator or oscillator 3. This way, anyone who's accustomed to the traditional way of using oscillator 3 as a mod source can continue to do so whenever it's not needed or not in use as an oscillator. And then on the right, you can choose between noise as a mod source or the new dedicated LFO. So there are some choices to be made, but they've been logically laid out with a thoughtful eye towards sound design, with a combination of filter envelope and triangle LFO working well for brassy lead sounds, filter envelope and noise working well for percussion sounds, oscillator 3 working well for FM type sounds, and so on. The modulation mix you set up here in the controller section can then be applied to the oscillators and or the filter via these switches that are sort of located on the border of the oscillator and filter sections. You can also use an external mod source via a CV jack here on the top panel with a cable inserted there that will occupy the noise position here on this selector switch. So if you've got a cool LFO module or want to attach a Moog EP3 expression pedal or some other external source, you can apply those to your sound as well. Also in the controller section, we find controls for glide, including a switch to engage glide and a knob for its rate. And then there's also a master tuning knob here to set the pitch of oscillator 1. Which brings us to the oscillator bank, where we find controls to set the tuning and waveforms for all 3 oscillators. Each oscillator has a 6-position switch to set the fundamental octave across a range of 5 octaves. And then oscillators 2 and 3 have fine-tuning knobs to set their pitch relative to oscillator 1, whether you want to set them at some harmonic intervals to voice chord-like sounds, or just detune them slightly for more of a chorusing effect. Each oscillator also has a 6-position waveform selector switch with a harmonically dense sawtooth well suited to lead and bass sounds. There's a more gentle triangle wave. And then a sawtooth triangle hybrid that sort of splits the difference between the two. There are also 3 different pulse waves, a square, and then wide and narrow rectangle shapes. Oscillator 3 drops the triangle sawtooth hybrid and instead has a reverse sawtooth waveform, which doesn't sound all that different from the regular sawtooth when used as an oscillator, but is actually much more useful when using Oscillator 3 as a mod source, because in that scenario it gives you more of a sort of reverse ramp type of sound, which you can hear better at lower frequencies. Over to the mixer section, we find on-off switches and volume controls for each of the three oscillators, and then similar controls for the quarter-inch external audio input, which you can use to layer sounds with whatever you've got going on in the Minimoog, or on its own to shape external sounds using the gates and envelopes, or to filter them using the Moog ladder filter. There's a popular hack on vintage Model Ds where you feed the low main output back into the external audio input to further beef up your sound. And on these newer units, that's built in, such that when there's no cable connected to the external audio input, the main output is normaled back into the external input signal path. To people accustomed to doing the feedback loop hack on vintage Model Ds, this will seem like normal behavior, but if you're not accustomed to doing it with cables, it can take a little wrapping your head around the fact that with nothing connected, the external input volume level is post-main output, such that the main output volume level will influence the level of the normaled feedback. For this reason, Moog recommends keeping the main output below 6 or so for the most musical results, but the sweet spot between these two controls is going to vary from patch to patch. Regardless of whether you're actually feeding in an external sound or doing the feedback loop, the overload lamp here will light when you are overloading the mixer. This is less a warning or alert or something to avoid, and more just a helpful indicator of when you're crossing into the realms of overdrive and distortion with your sounds. In the mixer section, there are also controls for noise. And these will affect noise both when used as a sound source and also when used as a modulation source. And for those of you who understand the differences, the harmonic differences among different types of noise better than I do, it's worth pointing out that when you're using noise as a mod source, the white setting here will produce pink noise as a mod source, while the pink setting will produce more of a brownie and red noise. Over to the modifiers, or filter and envelope section. On our way into this section, in addition to the switch we discussed earlier for turning filter modulation on and off, there are two switches to control keyboard control or key tracking, where the cutoff frequency of the filter will track with the pitches being fed into the CV pitch in or played on the keyboard. And the easiest way to think of these two switches are having the key tracking divided into thirds, where with both switches off, there will obviously be no key tracking. With just switch 1 engaged, you get 1/3 key tracking. With just switch 2, it's 2/3 key tracking. And with both switches engaged, you get full key tracking. At higher emphasis or resonance levels, the filter can be driven to self-oscillate. And then with key tracking engaged, you can actually play the filter. So you could actually think of this filter self-oscillation as a sixth sound source on top of the three oscillators, the external audio input, and the noise source, sort of a sine wave oscillator. Also in the modifier section are the contour or envelope controls for both the amp and filter envelope. And it's interesting to note that for the attack and decay controls, rather than being expressed in the sort of scaled 0 to 10 format that we're used to, they're actually expressed as time, with shorter values in milliseconds here on the left-hand side, and much longer values in seconds here on the right. The sustain portion of the envelopes, on the other hand, does have the typical 0 to 10 scaling. And then there's also a amount of contour control for the filter envelope, which will affect the extent to which the envelope will affect the cutoff frequency. And unlike on more modern Moog synths, this is not a bipolar control, so you can't invert the filter envelope by dialing it into negative territory. As we mentioned back in the controller section, there's a switch over here to engage a second decay portion of the envelope that follows the sustain portion, which is more commonly referred to as release. So with the switch engaged, that second decay value will share its time with the decay portion of the envelope that follows the attack, and refers to the amount of time that it will take the amp envelope to fade all the way out, and for the filter envelope to return to the value set by the frequency knob. The output section is fairly straightforward, with volume level knobs for both the main output and the headphone out, as well as a switch to turn the main output on and off. This way, without adjusting your level, you could take yourself out of the mix, make some tweaks to your sound in headphones, and then bring yourself back in. There's also this A440 switch, which will play a reference tone both into the main outputs and the headphone out, so that you can keep your oscillators in tune all the time. On the top panel, in addition to a V-trig gate input and control voltage inputs for loudness, filter, cutoff frequency, oscillator pitch, and mod source or LFO in, there are now CV gate outputs with a V-trig gate out, as well as CV outs for pitch and keyboard velocity and after pressure. Up on the top is also where we find the external audio input jack, as well as the high and low outputs, with the high output jack best suited for connecting to your mixer or audio interface, and the low output best suited for connecting to high gain, high impedance inputs such as those on a guitar amplifier. There's a 30 dB difference between the two outputs. Also on the top panel is where we find one of the biggest additions to these newer Model D units, MIDI. On the input side, the newer Model Ds can receive MIDI note, velocity, and pitch bend values, as well as sysex commands, while the MIDI out jack can transmit MIDI note, velocity, pitch bend, and aftertouch values. New Model D units also respond to a number of power on commands, which are invoked by holding down certain keys or key combinations as you power it up. In addition to setting various MIDI functions like channel, transpose, MIDI pitch bend, and aftertouch on and off, and selecting among 3 different MIDI velocity curves, there are some other handy settings as well. Vintage Model Ds are all permanently set to low note priority for their pitch and gate responses, but using power on commands on these newer Model Ds, you can set that instead to be high note or last note priority, And in addition, you can also engage a legato mode where the gates and envelopes will only be re-triggered upon new key presses after all other keys have been released. Using power on commands, you can set the gate sources to various combinations of the external V-trig input, the keyboard, and MIDI note on information. You can set the scaling of the velocity CV out to 10 volts instead of 5, and you can set the pitch CV0 to values other than the default C. There are also two really interesting power on commands related to tuning. In addition to standard tuning, you can choose from 3 different alternate tuning tables. There's a Pythagorean C scale, a Wendy Carlos harmonic 12-tone scale, and a Harry Partch 43-tone scale. You can also engage what Moog calls the keyboard tuning error to mimic the subtle tuning variations generated by the Pratt-Reed keyboard on vintage Model Ds. With this keyboard tuning error switched on, a random error value within 10 cents will be applied to each key press to get that vintage drift and feel. Physically, the Model D is housed in a handsome cabinet made from locally sourced Appalachian hardwood with a hand-finished aluminum chassis, and the power supply has been removed from the main housing and broken out to an external unit with a standard swappable IEC cable going from the power supply to the wall. There's also a 3-position kickstand in the back to set the angle of the front panel at 3 different heights. So that's the Moog Minimoog Model D. And again, to get an order together for your Model D, please get in touch with your Craft Music sales advisor or check out our online store at craftmusic.com. Moog has been very upfront about the fact that the complex build process for these Model Ds means that they can only produce a handful of units every month. So it's hard to say when supply might catch up with demand, but for now at least, it's worth getting your order in sooner than later to secure your place in line. Once again, I'm John from Craft Music. Thanks for watching.
Thank you.